Hi, I'm Greg Hunter. Thanks for joining USAWatchdog.com. With me, Paul Craig Roberts. He's a former Assistant Treasury Secretary under the Reagan Administration. And Mr. Roberts, I'm going to give you a big build-up because what you say is pretty amazing and pretty dire. And that you were in charge of all monetary policy for the Treasury. You have a PhD in economics. And just recently you wrote a post called Collapse at Hand. Now, those are strong words for a man of your caliber and experience. Why did you write that?
Well, it's the truth. People need to know what's going on. The crisis that the United States is in is worse than the European crisis or the Greek crisis. But instead of dealing with it, Washington keeps attention focused on Europe. All the problems are over there.
They do have some big problems, though.
They're nowhere near as big as the ones here, and it serves as a diversion of attention and focus. And so the other day, Obama gives a speech, and he says, look, our recovery might be jeopardized by events in Europe. In other words, Europe becomes an excuse. But the problems here, there are really two problems. The worst one is that in the last 15 years, middle-class jobs have been offshored. They're gone. Manufacturing jobs are gone, but also the professional service jobs, the kinds of jobs that university graduates took, software engineering, information technology, research, design, these kinds of jobs are also gone offshore. So when the middle class shrinks, or there's no employment for university graduates, then the income of the country shrinks and consumer demand shrinks. And so how do you maintain economic growth? So what Greenspan did was to cause a credit expansion. He lowered the interest rates. This caused a real estate boom. Housing prices rose. People were able to refinance their mortgages and take out the rise in price, equity of the house, and spend it. And so by going deeper into debt, taking larger mortgages, taking on more credit card debt, they were able to keep the economy going along. Well, once everyone gets so thoroughly indebted that there's no more room to take more debt, that process ends. Now, of course, that process is what fueled the room for the banks with their subprime derivatives, their leveraged up derivatives, and it led into the financial crisis.
But that's just the opening act, 2008. Everybody thinks, 2008 is over. And then a guy like you comes along and says, oh, no, it's not over. We're going to have a collapse. I mean, a collapse.
Well, if you can't drive the economy by any means, then there's no way for economic growth to proceed. And since there's no growth in consumer income, because so many of the high-income jobs, the middle-class jobs, are gone, and since the country is up to its eyeballs in debt, it can't take on more debt in order to be able to spend more. So there's no way for the economy to really grow, and yet all of their budget solutions, debt solutions are based on forecasts of economic growth. Well, that can't take place. In addition, they haven't dealt with the causes of the financial crisis, which is deregulation. The financial deregulation, the left wing likes to blame it on Reagan, but none of it occurred under Reagan. It began in the second term of Bill Clinton.
Oh, yeah, that's right, because they signed away the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial banking from investment banking. Commercial banking got FDIC insurance, and investment banking, if you want to make crazy bets, if they blow up, you're dead. You're done. But that's not what we have today. We have J.P. Morgan that has, $70 trillion in derivatives. and they have an FDIC insurance policy.
Well, when you repeal Glass-Steagall, which was done in the second Clinton term, you turn commercial banks into investment banks, and all of a sudden, the banks can speculate with depositors' deposits. And once the banks can use your checking account for speculating in poorly understood and very risky and highly leveraged financial instruments, all sorts of bad things can happen.
And they're going to happen, are they not? I mean, we're not through this.
Yeah.
This little $2 billion loss, they say, has been reported as much bigger from J.P. Morgan. They've sold $25 billion in assets. I've heard up to $6 and $7 billion already, and a lot of people think it'll go much higher.
Yes, and nobody knows what next mistake will be made. You see, you mentioned the $70 trillion of interest rate swaps that are on J.P. Morgan's books. Well, those 70 trillion in interest rate swaps are not bets that are covered. They're simply bets. They're bets between two parties on the movement of interest rates. So no real assets are involved. The values are notional, but they're bets. It's like you and I betting on the outcome of a football game. But these bets are not covered because the risk capital is only a tiny percentage of the bets. In fact, according to the latest information from the Comptroller of the Currency, J.P. Morgan's bets on interest rate swaps are something like 500, 600 times its risk capital.
Are they the worst?
No. The worst is Goldman Sachs. Their bets on interest rate swaps are 2,300 times greater than their risk capital.
Oh, what could go wrong there?
Well, if you see, as long as they don't have to settle these bets, but if they have to settle them, there's a huge amount of risk. In other words, according to the Comptroller of the Currency, there's a total of $230 trillion in derivatives. These are bets. 96% belong to the 5 largest U.S. banks. And of that amount, 81% are interest rate swaps, which are bets on the movement in Treasury bond interest rates.
Interest rates. If people look at me and say, is this a good time to buy a house? And I say, listen, the Fed, some people say that this is a flight to quality, but there are plenty of people, I think you are one of them, that say this is nothing more than a suppression game by Wall Street and the Fed, the government. They are pushing down interest rates. And I say, well, what happens when rates just go back from 3.6% or whatever they are now for a 30-year loan and under 3% for 15? What happens when they just go back to 6 or 7%? And it's going to be another big cliff dive for the housing market, is it not?
Yes, and the cliff dive that we're currently experiencing isn't over. But you see, they're able to, look, here's the real question. How is it possible for the Federal Reserve to maintain essentially a zero interest rate for banks and to maintain less than a 2% interest rate on 10-year Treasury bonds when the interest rates are less than the rate of inflation? In other words, you're receiving a negative rate of interest when you buy a Treasury bond because they're paying you less than the inflation rate. So your principal is eroding. Now, how can this be possible when they're adding $1.5 trillion in new Treasury debt every year? How do you do that with practically zero interest rates? And the way you do it is the large banks like J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, they sell interest rate swaps. And when you sell an interest rate swap, without going into the details of the transaction, the effect is to drive down Treasury interest rates. That is, to drive up Treasury bond prices. When the bond price rises, the interest rate falls. So by selling these interest rate swaps, the large banks support the Fed's untenable policy. In other words, it's nonsensical that you can have such low interest rates when you're just flooding the market with new debt.
And you're saying that at some point, interest rates are going to go up.
They'll go up because the dollar in foreign exchange markets will take a hit. That is, its exchange value will fall. And as people start deserting dollar assets, then the demand for securities denominated in dollars falls. So the Fed would have to buy even more.
So they have to print even more money.
And when
you have a lot of stuff, then the price goes down.
The effect of buying even more is to cause more alarm among people who owe dollar-denominated assets, and so they start dumping them faster. And so what happens is the decline in the exchange rate of the dollar will force up the interest rates. And when that happens, the import prices, Americans are now an import-dependent economy. We're dependent on imports of our shoes, our clothes, our manufactured products, even advanced technology products. The other day, the CEO of Apple Computer says it really wasn't even possible to make an Apple computer in America. We just don't have the ability anymore. And though he says he hopes in some future time to be able to again make a computer in America. Well, so when the exchange rate falls and the price of imports rises, and so what does this do to living standards? I mean, people are already hard pressed. I mean, tens of millions of Americans are right on the margin, and all of a sudden, prices rise. Well, that's the same as a tax increase, or the effect of rising prices is you've got less real income, so your living standard falls.
And you think this is coming soon?
Already on the margin.
You think this is coming soon? I mean, is there any? The big question is, okay, collapse at hand, when? But you're saying you probably don't know exactly. Who knows? Who has crystal ball? But you're saying sooner than later. Is that right?
It seems it would have to be sooner than later. But it depends. How long can they keep the European crisis going as a diversion so nobody says, oh, look at the American problem? We don't know. That could go on. If that goes on for years, then this policy here can continue for years. We don't know how long the big banks can continue to issue interest rate swaps. I mean, if J.P. Morgan already has $70 trillion on his books, and the Goldman Sachs has $44 trillion. I mean, these are huge numbers. How much of this stuff can you add before somebody says, "What in the world? How can this be possible?" So we don't know. We don't know that. And then also there's the question of gold and silver prices. You see, last year the prices rose steadily, and what's happened this year is the prices are suppressed by short selling.
You think, no question, they are suppressed. They should be much higher.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they should be going through the roof. Instead, gold, they knocked gold down $350 an ounce this year. But the gold prices should be rising. Why? Because the debt is rising. The monetization of the debt is rising. The real issues are not being dealt with, so people should be seeking more security in bullion.
That's what I was going to ask you. What should people be doing? What should the common guy be doing? Maybe.
Well,
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
What we see happening is that the physical demand for metal is growing, and it should be driving up the price. But the naked short selling is overwhelming the demand for physical gold. And when they sell a short, they don't even have the gold. They're just selling a financial piece of paper. And the buyer of the short doesn't really want the gold or silver. He just wants the monetary settlement. So this lets them sell gold and silver short that they don't have. And this is the way they can suppress the price. And the fact that they're now driving the price down suggests to me that the situation is getting more desperate. I mean, last year they used short selling just to slow the rate of rise in the price. But this year they've actually do so much short selling they've driven the prices down. So how long can this go on? And if foreign central banks decide that they want to get out of their dollar reserves and go into bullion reserves, then you can have a situation where the foreign central banks can use the short selling to add to their own gold reserves at a low price. And this takes gold off the market and, of course, away from private individuals who might like to seek refuge in gold.
So what should the common before I go to that, let me ask you this. What should the common person do if they don't have gold? Should they buy silver? Should they, fix their house, make sure everything's in good working order, buy tires, maybe store some food? Not because there won't be any food, because it'll never be cheaper. What do you think people should do?
Well, I think people have to do all those kinds of things as an insurance policy in case there is some sort of major upheaval.
Like if war. If there's war, it's game, set, match.
Just the dollar. If the financial upheaval, if the dollar goes, your dollar holdings won't buy anything. So it would be a good idea to have some silver coins just so you can continue to shop until you can figure out how to adjust to the new situation. You should have some ability to store some food just because you don't know what kind of runs there might be on supermarkets. I mean, if you can't get food for a week, that's a terrible situation to be in. So you should have some sort of backup there.
And you think when the currency cracks, it'll crack.
It does.
It'll be fast.
If it does crack, you need to have some ability to adjust to whatever the new situation. If you don't have any ability to do that, then you're at great risk. And also, if you've got major repairs on your house or your car that you face, it's probably better to do them now than when things crack, because you may not have any way of paying for it, or the prices may go out of sight. The last thing you want to do is have to put new tires on the car when the dollar loses its value.
And you're saying that from here on out, collapse at hand is, from here on out, it could be at hand. You can have a collapse if there's somebody sinks a ship in the Persian Gulf, if these sanctions that we may put on Iran about a kind of a blockade of air and sea, if this meeting in Russia doesn't go well. I mean, there's a lot of black swans and wild one-eyed jacks out there, aren't there?
Yes. Any of a number of things could set off the collapse. On the other hand, it could go on for several years.
And finally, I heard you say before in the past, and I'm just going to wrap up the interview this way. I heard you say that you were a high-ranking government official. I mean, you're one click off being the Treasury Secretary at Tim Geithner's job. So you had a very high job. You were in very high circles of power, and you said that those people don't really like you much anymore, that you don't really talk to them much anymore. Why is that? Were you ostracized?
Well, Washington is its own club, and you go along to get along. And they really don't like innovators in the first place. And, of course, Reagan was an innovator. He brought in the new supply-side policy, cured the stagflation. It required
Paul Volcker, the real maestro.
That's right. It required revamping the way you think about economic policy at that time. And he also was determined to end the Cold War. Well, that didn't suit the military security complex. They didn't want the Cold War over. It's too profitable. And yet he was determined that we would end it rather than to always have this risk of some sort of nuclear explosion. And so he was an innovator. Now, so the people who were associated with Reagan were also innovators because they were supporting his policies or trying to. And they just aren't welcome in Washington. They don't want innovators. I want people who are going to further the profitable relationships and revolving doors with the powerful private interests, and to keep the club running with the right kinds of people in the club.
Who won't tell the truth.
Who won't tell the truth.
You also work for the Wall Street Journal. And why don't you work for them anymore?
Well, since I was at the Wall Street Journal, it's been, first of all, it's been taken over by the neoconservatives, the editorial page has, and that's been incorporated into Murdoch's mega media empire. There's no longer any independence of journalism there. You have to go along with the line. You can't get on the wrong side of the government, because if you're part of a huge media company, the value of the company is the broadcast licenses that the government gives. And if that media company gets on the wrong side of the government, it might not get these licenses renewed. The journalists don't run media organizations anymore. They're run by corporate advertising executives. They know what the game is. They don't want to upset advertisers. They don't want to upset the government. And so the media has been transformed into a propaganda ministry for the government and for the powerful private interest groups that purchase the government with their campaign contributions. So there isn't a media anymore. There's a ministry of propaganda. Gerald Celente calls them prostitutes.
Yes, and you know what? I think Mr. Celente is right on the money. Hey, listen, well, we all appreciate your article, Collected Hand, could have been on the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, any CNN.com, could have been on any major publication. It was well done, well-researched, well-sourced. Me, as a journalist, saying that to you, I don't need to approve your work, but it was good. We all appreciate you telling the truth, and everybody would rather be forewarned and forearmed than to be kept in the dark. So thank you, Paul Craig Roberts. Can you tell people how to get a hold of you on the internet?
I have a website. It's www.paulcraigroberts.org.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul Craig Roberts, for being on USAWatchdog.com.
Yes.